The night I signed those papers, my mother held my hand. That's what I remember most. Not the nurse, not the cold room, not even the sound of my own heartbeat thudding so loud in my ears it felt like judgment. I remember my mother's hand. Firm, steady, certain. And mine? Shaking. She squeezed my fingers and said, "You're doing the right thing, baby. One day you'll thank me." I'm 62 now. I have arthritis in both knees. I keep peppermint in my purse for my stomach. I say, more than I say yes. I've buried friends. I've raised children. I've survived a marriage that should have ended sooner, and a silence that lasted longer than it should have. But I have never thanked her. Not for that. And if you're listening tonight, I want you to ask yourself something real quiet. Have you ever obeyed your mother and lost yourself in the process? Because that's what happened to me, and I didn't even realize it until decades later. Let me take you back. I was 21. 21 and soft in all the places life hadn't hardened yet. I still believed love could fix a man. I still believed if I just tried harder, prayed louder, cooked better, smiled sweeter, everything would turn out right. You know that kind of young? The kind that thinks grown folks always know better? I was living at home in Baltimore. My mother ran that house like it was a military base with lace curtains, floors shining, plastic still on the sofa, rules you didn't question, especially not in her house. My father had left when I was 12, just packed up and walked out. No warning, no explanation, just gone. My mother never cried in front of us. She just got stricter, harder, quieter. And somewhere in that quiet, I learned something without anyone ever saying it out loud. Men leave, women endure, and feelings are a luxury we can't afford. So when I met Daniel, I thought I'd found something different. He was gentle at first, smiled easy, talked about wanting a family, said he liked that I was not loud like other girls. Now see, if I could go back, I'd tell that young girl something. When a man compliments your silence, he plans to use it. But I didn't know that yet. We dated 8 months. 8 months of late-night phone calls and cheap movie dates and promises whispered in parked cars. And then I missed my cycle. I knew before the test turned positive. Women know. There's a stillness in your body that feels different, a quiet hum. When that second pink line showed up, I sat on the edge of the tub and just stared at it. I wasn't scared at first. I was stunned. Then I smiled, just a little, because in my mind, this meant permanence. It meant Daniel would stay. It meant I wouldn't end up like my mother, abandoned and bitter and alone. I held that test to my chest like it was a secret blessing. And then I told him. He didn't smile. He didn't hug me. He didn't even sit down. He just rubbed the back of his neck and said, "You sure?" Now, ladies, let me ask you something. When a man says, "You sure?" after you tell him you're carrying his child, what he really means is, "This is inconvenient." But again, I was young. I mistook hesitation for shock. He said he needed time. Time. Time is dangerous when you're pregnant because time moves whether a man decides to or not. 3 days later, he stopped answering my calls. By the end of the week, I heard from his cousin that he'd been seen with another girl. And just like that, I was 21, pregnant, and alone. Except I wasn't alone. I had my mother, and that's where everything changed. I told her on a Sunday evening. She was in the kitchen snapping green beans into a bowl like she was breaking bones. I stood there twisting my fingers until she finally looked up. "What is it?" Her voice was flat, controlled. "I'm pregnant." The beans stopped snapping. She didn't gasp, didn't yell, didn't ask who. She just stared at me. and that stare felt heavier than any scream. How far? About 6 weeks. She went back to snapping beans. You raised me better than this. Now, let me pause right there. Have you ever noticed how disappointment hurts worse than anger? Anger, you can fight back. Disappointment, that sinks into your skin. I tried to explain about Daniel, how he said he loved me, how he talked about marriage. She cut me off. Men say whatever they need to say. And that was that. The next morning, she called in sick to work. By afternoon, she had an appointment scheduled. I remember sitting at the kitchen table while she dialed numbers like she was ordering catering for a church banquet. Efficient, calm, decided. Wednesday at 9, she said after hanging up. What's Wednesday? Your appointment. My throat grew dry. I didn't say I wanted. She looked at me, not angry. Just firm. You are not ruining your life over some boy who can't even answer the phone. I can raise the baby, I said, my voice small. With what money? She replied. Silence. I'll help, she added, but her tone said something different. It said burden. And see, that's what broke me. I had grown up watching her struggle, double shifts, counting pennies, saying no to everything that wasn't necessary. I saw what single motherhood did to her. I saw the exhaustion, the hardness, and somewhere deep inside, I thought maybe she was protecting me from becoming her. She sat down across from me. Baby, she said softer now, you don't want this life. But she never asked if I wanted that baby. There's a difference. Wednesday came fast. Too fast. I barely slept the night before. I lay in bed with my hand on my stomach, whispering apologies to something that couldn't hear me yet. Or maybe it could. That morning, she drove. The car ride was quiet, except for gospel music playing low on the radio. You'll understand one day, she said as we pulled into the parking lot. That phrase, you'll understand one day. Let me tell you something, at 62, understanding doesn't erase regret. Inside, everything smelled sterile, cold, clinical. They handed me forms, so many forms. My hands trembled as I signed my name. And that's when she reached over and held my hand. You're doing the right thing, she whispered. And I believed her, because she was my mother, because she survived things I hadn't, because I thought obedience equaled wisdom. When it was over, I felt empty in a way I can't fully explain. Not dramatic, not loud, just hollow, like something had been erased. We drove home in silence. She made soup that night. I didn't cry. Not then. I told myself this was maturity, responsibility, strength. Daniel never called again. Life moved forward like nothing happened. I got a job, eventually met another man, married at 25, had 2 children in wedlock, as my mother liked to say, respectable, proper, approved. On the outside, I built the life she said I deserved. But every March, the month that baby would have been born, I felt restless. I'd count years in my head without meaning to. 1, 5, 10, 20. By 30 years, it stopped being math. It became a presence. You ever carry a memory so long it feels like a shadow? That was mine. I never told my husband, never told my children, not even my closest friend from church. Silence can become a habit, and habits can become identity. But here's the part I didn't expect. Regret doesn't always show up immediately. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it lets you build a whole life first. And then, when you think you're settled, it knocks hard. The knock came when my daughter was 22, same age I had been. She sat me down one afternoon, twisting her fingers the same way I used to. "Mom, I'm pregnant." Time folded in on itself. I looked at her, saw fear, saw hope, saw me. And before I could stop myself, I heard my mother's voice come out of my mouth. "Are you sure this is what you want?" The room went quiet. My daughter's face fell, just slightly, and in that moment, something cracked open inside me. Because I realized I was about to repeat history. I was about to pass down silence like it was heirloom china. And that terrified me more than becoming a grandmother. But what I did next, that's something I've carried shame about ever since. Because I didn't break the cycle that day. I continued it. And that decision, it changed my relationship with my daughter in ways I'm still trying to repair. If you think my regret was only about that first pregnancy, oh no, that was just the beginning. Because what happened with my daughter 22 years later forced me to confront something I had buried so deep, I almost convinced myself it never existed. And when my mother fell ill not long after, the truth finally surfaced. But by then, it was almost too late. When my daughter told me she was pregnant, I smiled. Can you believe that? I smiled. Not because I was happy, not because I was ready, but because smiling is what women like me learn to do when we're panicking. You tighten your lips, nod your head, and keep everything from spilling out onto the floor. She was sitting at my kitchen table, the same one I'd bought 20 years earlier when we moved into that house. Sunlight was coming through the blinds, cutting across her face in thin stripes. She looked young, too young, even though she was grown. And suddenly I saw how small she still was in my mind. "Mom," she asked, watching my face carefully, "say something." And I did the worst thing I could have done. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Well, what are you planning to do?" Now that sounds neutral, doesn't it? Reasonable. But tone matters, and my tone carried weight. She heard it. I saw it in her shoulders. "I think I want to keep it," she said quietly. Think. Want. Both words fragile. And that's when fear started speaking through me instead of love. "Are you sure?" I asked. The same words Daniel said to me. The same words that made my stomach drop all those years ago. Funny how trauma recycles language. She looked down at her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm scared." There it was. Scared. I should have reached across the table. I should have told her she wasn't alone. I should have said, "We'll figure this out together." Instead, I heard myself say, "You don't want to make a mistake you'll regret." Now, let me pause here. Have you ever realized you are becoming your mother mid-sentence? It's like hearing an echo in your own voice. You want to grab the words back, but once they're out, they're out. She nodded slowly. "Grandma always said timing matters." There it was again, 3 generations of women letting timing decide motherhood instead of the heart. I told her we should explore her options. Such polite language, such clean phrasing. Options. As if we were choosing curtains, as if we weren't talking about life. She left that day uncertain, and I told myself I was being practical, responsible, protective. But that night I couldn't sleep, because something inside me whispered, "You know exactly how this feels. You know what you're pushing her toward." And I ignored it. A week later, she made her decision. She told me softly over the phone, "I think it's for the best." Those words, "for the best." I swallowed hard and said, "Okay." That's all I said. "Okay." And just like that, history repeated itself. I went with her. I held her hand. I told her she was strong. Do you see the pattern? Strong, responsible, right thing. The same script. But here's what I didn't expect. Afterward, she didn't come home and sit quietly like I did. She didn't fold inward. She unraveled. She cried in a way I never allowed myself to cry. She asked questions I never dared to ask. Mom, what if I made a mistake? And every time she asked, something twisted inside my chest. Because I knew the answer, but I didn't have the courage to give it. Months passed. She grew distant, stopped coming by as often, stopped calling just to talk. I told myself it was normal. She was busy. Young people move on quickly, right? But distance has a texture. It feels thin and sharp. One evening, she came over unexpectedly. Her eyes were red. I had a dream, she said. What kind of dream? I was holding a little girl. She had your eyes. The air left my lungs. I felt 21 again, sitting on that bathtub edge, staring at two pink lines. I can't stop thinking about it, she whispered. And that's when the dam inside me cracked, because for the first time in 40 years, I said it out loud. I was pregnant before you. Her head snapped up. What? I nodded slowly. When I was 21. She stared at me like I'd just confessed to living a secret life. Grandma knew? Yes. And? I swallowed. She told me it wasn't the right time. My daughter's face changed, something between anger and grief. So you let her decide? That question pierced deeper than anything else. Did I let her decide, or did I choose obedience because it was easier than standing alone? I didn't know how to answer, so I said the truth. I thought I was protecting my future. And did you? I opened my mouth, closed it, and for the first time in decades, I admitted something I had never said out loud. I don't know. Silence filled the room. Heavy, uncomfortable, honest. She wiped her face. I wish you had told me. I didn't know how. Or you didn't want to. That one stung, because she was right. Silence had become my coping mechanism. If you don't name it, you don't have to feel it. That night, after she left, I sat at my kitchen table long after the dishes were done. I thought about my mother, about how certain she sounded, about how confident she was that she was saving me. And I wondered, did she ever question herself, or did she bury it the way I did? 2 weeks later, my mother fell in the grocery store, collapsed right near the canned vegetables. A neighbor from church called me. By the time I got to the hospital, she was hooked up to machines that beeped rhythmically like mechanical heartbeats. She looked smaller in that bed. Age had finally softened her edges. The doctor said it was her heart, weak, tired. I sat beside her that night listening to the steady hum of hospital equipment, and for the first time, I didn't feel like her child. I felt like the adult in the room. She opened her eyes just before midnight. You're here, she whispered. Of course I am. She studied my face carefully. You look troubled. I almost laughed. 62 years old, and she could still read me. There's something I never asked you, I said quietly. She frowned slightly. About what? About when I was pregnant. The room shifted. Her jaw tightened just enough for me to notice. You made the right choice, she said automatically. Automatic, like a rehearsed line. But did you ever wonder if it was my choice? I asked. Silence. Machines, beeping. Her eyes moved to the ceiling. I was trying to protect you. I know. You would have struggled. I know. You would have been alone. I was alone anyway. That slipped out before I could stop it. Her eyes flickered. What do you mean? I mean, I felt alone, even with you. That hurt to say, but it was true. She turned her head away. For a long time she didn't speak, and then, in a voice softer than I'd ever heard it, She said something that changed everything. I was scared. I blinked. Of what? Of you becoming me. The words hung between us. She continued slowly. I didn't regret having you, but I regretted how hard it was. I regretted the loneliness. I regretted depending on a man who walked away. She swallowed. I thought if I could spare you that pain, I should. I stared at her. All these years I thought she was cold, certain, unmoved, but she was just afraid. And fear can disguise itself as authority. You never asked me what I wanted, I whispered. I was afraid you'd say you wanted it, she replied. That confession cracked something wide open. We were two women bound by the same fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of struggle, fear of repeating pain. And because we were afraid, we made permanent decisions in temporary storms. The next day, my daughter came to the hospital. She stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed. 3 generations, 3 different kinds of regret. My mother looked at her and said, I heard about the baby. My daughter stiffened. I'm sorry, my mother added. 2 words I never expected to hear. I thought I was helping your mother. Maybe I was wrong. Tears slipped down my daughter's cheeks. I just wanted someone to tell me it was okay to want it, she whispered, and that sentence sliced through all of us, because none of us had ever heard that. It's okay to want it. My mother reached out her trembling hand. Then I should have said that. We sat there holding hands, hospital lights humming above us, and I realized something profound. Regret isn't inherited, but silence is. And if nobody breaks it, it passes down like a family recipe nobody actually likes but keeps cooking anyway. Later that night, after my daughter left, my mother looked at me. You can still break it, she said. How? By telling the truth. I nodded slowly. But telling the truth meant admitting something bigger, something I had avoided my entire adult life. Because here's the part I haven't told you yet. The regret wasn't just emotional. It wasn't just what if. It was something that followed me in ways I didn't understand until much later. Something that affected my marriage, my confidence, my sense of worth. Something that shaped how I loved, and how I withheld love. And, if I'm being honest, there was one more secret about that first pregnancy. One detail I had buried so deep that even I almost forgot it, until my mother's hospital room forced it back into the light. And when I finally spoke that detail aloud, it changed how my daughter saw me. It changed how I saw myself. And it changed the way we would move forward as women in this family. But I wasn't ready to say it yet, not even then, because some truths take time to rise. And the next truth? It came the night my mother asked me a question I never expected, a question that forced me to confront not just regret, but responsibility. The night my mother asked me that question, the hospital room felt smaller than it had all day. It was close to 2 a.m. The hallway outside was quiet, except for the distant squeak of rubber soles and the soft roll of a medication cart. The lights were dimmed low, casting everything in a grayish glow that made time feel suspended. She had been drifting in and out of sleep, but then she opened her eyes and looked straight at me. Did you ever see it? She asked. Her voice was thin, but clear. See what? I leaned closer. The ultrasound. My breath caught. Now, understand something. When I was 21, ultrasounds weren't handed to you like souvenir photos. It wasn't the same as today. But yes, there had been one, and I had seen it. Just once. I hadn't told anyone that part. Not my husband, not my daughter, not even myself in full sentences. I did, I said quietly. She closed her eyes for a moment. What did it look like? The question hung there. What did it look like? You'd think after 40 years the image would blur. You'd think memory would soften the edges. It didn't. It looked small, I whispered, like a flicker. I swallowed. There was a heartbeat. Saying it out loud made my chest tighten. A heartbeat. That word changes everything, doesn't it? You can ignore a mistake, you can rationalize a situation, but a heartbeat? That lingers. My mother's hand trembled slightly against the blanket. She didn't know that, she said. No, I replied. You didn't ask. That wasn't accusation, it was fact. She nodded slowly. I thought if I kept it practical, you wouldn't get attached. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so tragically human. As if attachment needs permission, as if love waits for approval. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to protect someone by controlling the information they receive? Have you ever thought, if I just don't let her feel too much, she won't hurt as bad? That's what she did, and that's what I did to my daughter. Control dressed up as care. The monitor beside her bed beeped steadily. I need to ask you something, she said. Okay. Do you hate me? Now, that question broke something inside me, because all these years I never allowed myself to fully examine that feeling. Did I hate her? No. Did I resent her? Sometimes. Did I blame her? Often. But hate? No. I don't hate you, I said firmly. She searched my face like she was measuring truth. I thought you did, she admitted. That stunned me. For what? For making you do something you didn't want. I sat back, because that sentence forced clarity. I didn't make you, I said slowly. She frowned. I was grown, I continued. I chose obedience. That word landed heavy. Obedience. See, we don't talk about that enough in our community. We talk about respect, we talk about honor, we talk about not talking back. But obedience? Obedience can cost you parts of yourself. And the painful truth is, I could have said no. I didn't. I chose safety over uncertainty. I chose my mother's approval over my own instinct. And that realization shifted something in me. For years, I had carried the regret like a stone with her name carved on it. But that night, I realized my name was on it too. Responsibility doesn't erase pain, but it gives it context. She exhaled slowly. I thought you'd fight me, she murmured. I thought so too, I admitted. We both fell quiet. It's strange, the conversations you have when death feels close. There's less posturing, less pride, more truth. After a few minutes, she said something I never expected. I think about that baby sometimes. I stared at her. You do? Yes. Her eyes filled with tears that she didn't wipe away. I wonder who they would have been. They. Not it. They. Language shifts matter. I used to count, she continued softly. Birthdays. My throat tightened. So did I. We looked at each other, and in that moment something passed between us. Not blame, not anger. Shared grief. Unspoken for decades. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Grief doesn't disappear just because you justify the decision. You can believe something was necessary and still mourn it. Both can exist. That realization felt almost freeing. Almost. The next morning, the doctor told us her heart was weakening. She needs rest, he said gently. Rest. Such a peaceful word for something so final. My daughter came by that afternoon, again. She stood near the window, arms crossed tightly over her chest. I could see she was still carrying her own storm. After a while, my mother motioned for her to come closer. I need you to hear something, my mother said. My daughter stepped forward cautiously. When your mother was pregnant, I was afraid, she continued. I let my fear decide. She paused, catching her breath. And when you were pregnant, I think that fear traveled down. My daughter glanced at me. I nodded slowly. I'm sorry, my mother whispered. Tears slid down my daughter's face. I just needed someone to say it was okay, she repeated. My mother squeezed her hand. It was okay. 3 words. 40 years late for me, but right on time for her. And in that hospital room, I felt something shift generationally, like a chain loosening. But healing doesn't happen in one conversation. It unfolds, it stretches, it tests you. Because after that day, I had to face something much harder than grief. I had to face my marriage. You see, I never told my husband about the first pregnancy. Not before we married, not during our engagement, not even during arguments. It stayed locked away. And secrets have a way of shaping intimacy. There were moments in my marriage when I pulled back emotionally and didn't even know why. Moments when my husband would ask, "Why do you seem so far away?" And I'd shrug it off. But I see it now. Part of me was always protecting myself from attachment, because once you've detached from something that deeply once, you learn how to numb quickly. And that numbness followed me into motherhood too. I loved my children fiercely, but there was a thin layer of distance I couldn't explain, a fear of loving too fully, a fear that something could be taken. That's what unresolved grief does. It reshapes your nervous system, even if you never name it. One evening, after leaving the hospital, I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. The house lights were on. My husband was inside watching television. Life. Normal. Routine. Predictable. And I realized something uncomfortable. He didn't know the full version of me. He knew the responsible wife, the church-going mother, the dependable partner. But he didn't know the 21-year-old girl on the bathtub edge holding a pregnancy test. He didn't know the flicker on the ultrasound screen. He didn't know the march counting. And that distance? That was mine. I created it because I believed silence was strength. That night, I decided something. If I was going to break the cycle for my daughter, I had to break it fully, not halfway, not selectively, fully. Which meant telling my husband, and that terrified me more than confronting my mother ever did. Because what if he judged me? What if he saw me differently? What if he thought I was irresponsible? Funny how at 62, we're still afraid of being seen. So I went inside. He looked up from the couch. "You okay?" he asked. I sat down beside him. "There's something I never told you." He muted the television. That alone made my heart race. And as I opened my mouth to speak, I realized this was the first time in 40 years I was about to say the entire story without minimizing it, without trimming the edges, without softening the truth. But before I could begin, my phone rang. It was the hospital. And the tone of the nurse's voice told me everything before she finished the sentence. "Your mother is asking for you." As we drove back through the quiet streets, my husband holding my hand, I felt layers of time collapsing because I knew this might be the last conversation, and there was still one question I hadn't asked her. One question that had lingered under the surface for decades. A question about something she said to me the morning of the appointment. Something I didn't fully understand at 21, but understood all too clearly now. And if her answer was what I feared it might be, it would mean the story I told myself all these years wasn't entirely true. By the time we reached the hospital, the sky was still dark, but beginning to soften at the edges. That in-between hour. Not quite night, not quite morning. It felt fitting. My husband parked, and for a moment neither of us moved. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the weight of all the years I had kept him outside a door he didn't even know existed. "I know," I whispered. Inside, the hallway lights were low. The nurse gave me that quiet look nurses give when they already know the ending of the story. "She's awake," she said softly, "but she's tired." I walked into the room alone. My mother's breathing was slower now, heavier. Each inhale seemed deliberate, like her body was measuring effort. She turned her head slightly when she heard me. "You came back." "Of course I did." I pulled the chair close and took her hand. It felt thinner than it ever had, fragile, as if time had finally collected its debt. "There's something I need to ask you," I said. Her eyes fluttered open. "What is it?" That question I'd been carrying for decades sat in my throat. The morning of the appointment, 40 years ago, she had said something to me in the car. I didn't understand it then. I barely registered it, but it echoed in my mind for years. She had said, "I can't go through this again." Again. At 21, I thought she meant she couldn't go through the stress of raising another baby in the house. But now I wasn't so sure. "Mom," I said carefully, "what did you mean when you said you couldn't go through it again?" Her fingers twitched in mine. For a long moment, she didn't answer. And then she exhaled slowly. "I had one before you." The room tilted. "What?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I was 17. 17? You had a baby?" I whispered. She shook her head. "No, I was pregnant, before I married your father." My heart began to pound. "And?" Her voice grew faint. "My mother made the decision for me." The air left my lungs. 4 generations. No, 3, but it felt like more. My mother said it would ruin everything, said I'd never get married, said I'd shame the family. She swallowed hard. I didn't want to, but I was scared. Scared. That word again. "And after?" I asked softly. "I never talked about it," she said. "I buried it so deep I almost convinced myself it didn't matter." She looked at me with a pain I had never seen before. "When you came home pregnant, I panicked. I felt like I was watching my own life replay. I thought if I could control it this time, maybe I could undo my own regret." I sat there stunned. All these years, I thought I was the beginning of the story. I wasn't. I was the continuation. "I didn't want you to carry the same burden," she whispered. "I didn't know I was handing it to you anyway." Tears slid down my face before I even realized I was crying. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. Her lips trembled. "Because I was ashamed." There it was. Shame. The family inheritance nobody writes into the will. Shame wrapped in silence, silence disguised as strength. I squeezed her hand tighter. "Did you ever think about that baby?" I asked. She nodded faintly. "Every April." April. my March. Different months, same counting. I closed my eyes and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not even grief. Recognition. This wasn't just about a single decision. This was about women surviving the only way they knew how. And survival sometimes looks like suppression. Have you ever noticed how women are praised for endurance, but rarely given space for grief? We're told to move on, be strong, don't dwell. But grief doesn't expire just because it's inconvenient. My mother looked at me again. I thought if I made your decision quickly, you wouldn't get attached. I almost smiled through tears. I already was, I said. She nodded slowly. I know that now. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, almost rhythmically, like it was counting down. I need you to promise me something, she whispered. What? Don't let it continue. Her eyes shifted toward the door, toward where my daughter had stood earlier. Let her choose without fear. I swallowed hard. I will. And in that moment, I meant it with every fiber of my being. But promises are tested, especially when life throws new complications into old wounds. Her breathing grew heavier. I'm tired, she murmured. I know. She squeezed my hand weakly. I love you, she said. Simple, clear, not wrapped in instruction or correction, just love. I love you too, I whispered. Those were the last words we exchanged while she was fully awake. She passed the next afternoon, quietly, almost gently. At the funeral, people described her as strong, disciplined, devoted. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know the full story. They didn't know the April counting, the 17-year-old girl who never got to speak her own heart. As I stood beside her casket, I felt two kinds of grief. Grief for losing my mother, and grief for the women we both were before fear hardened us. After the service, my daughter came to my house. She didn't say much at first, just helped clear dishes, fold chairs, stack leftovers. When everyone else left, we sat at the kitchen table in silence. Finally, she spoke. So it started before you? Yes. She nodded slowly. That's heavy. It is. She traced circles on the table with her finger. Mom, if I get pregnant again one day, I need you to say something different. Her words were steady. I will, I said. Don't ask me what I'm going to do, she added softly. Ask me how I feel. That sentence lodged itself deep inside me. Ask me how I feel. Not what's practical, not what's responsible, not what's convenient. How I feel. Why does that sound so simple and yet so revolutionary? For weeks after my mother's passing, I kept replaying everything in my mind. The 17-year-old version of her, the 21-year-old version of me, the 22-year-old version of my daughter. 3 women separated by decades, but united by silence. I started having dreams. In one dream, I was standing in a long hallway lined with doors. Behind each door was a version of myself at a different age, 17, 21, 40, 62, and at the end of the hallway stood a small child I couldn't quite see clearly. I would wake up with my heart racing. Now, I'm not one to make everything mystical, but sometimes your subconscious speaks louder than your daytime logic, and mine was asking a question I hadn't fully faced yet. What would forgiveness look like? Not just forgiving my mother, not just forgiving myself, but forgiving the younger version of me who didn't know how to stand alone. Because here's the truth I was slowly uncovering. Regret doesn't only come from the decision itself, it comes from the version of yourself you left behind. That 21-year-old girl, she didn't need correction, she needed courage, and nobody gave it to her, not even me. About a month after the funeral, my daughter called me unexpectedly. Her voice sounded different, steadier. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About trying again." My heart skipped. "Are you sure?" Almost slipped out of my mouth. Almost. But I caught it. Instead, I took a breath and asked, "How do you feel about that?" There was a pause on the other end. Then she said, "Hopeful." Hopeful. That word felt like sunlight. "Then I support you," I said. And for the first time, those words felt pure. No fear underneath them, no control hidden inside. Just support. But life doesn't move in straight lines. And just when I thought the story was shifting toward healing, a conversation with my husband brought up something I hadn't considered. Something that would force me to confront not just the past, but the consequences of decades of emotional distance. Because when I finally told him the full truth about that first pregnancy, his reaction wasn't what I expected. Not anger, not judgment, something else. Something that made me question whether silence had cost me more than I realized. And what he said that night, it made me see my entire marriage through a new lens. I told my husband 3 nights after my mother's funeral. There never feels like a right time to reveal something you've hidden for 40 years. There's no candlelight moment for that, no soft music. Just a quiet evening, dishes done, television low, and a weight in your chest that refuses to let you sleep. He was sitting in his recliner, glasses low on his nose, reading something on his tablet. Ordinary, peaceful. And I thought, you don't even know who you married. That sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But secrets create distance, even small ones. And this wasn't small. "Can we talk?" I asked. He looked up immediately. "Of course." That simple response made my throat tighten, because he had always been that way, steady, available, not perfect, but present. I sat across from him instead of beside him. I don't know why. Maybe I needed the space. "There's something I never told you," I began. He removed his glasses completely now, gave me his full attention. "That sounds serious," he said gently. "It is." My hands were clasped so tightly they hurt. "I was pregnant before we met." His expression didn't change immediately, just quiet processing. "Okay," he said softly. I took a breath. "My mother convinced me to end it." There it was, laid bare. The room felt still. He leaned back slightly, eyes steady on mine. "How old were you?" he asked. 21. He nodded slowly. "And you've never told anyone?" "No." "Why not me?" That question didn't come with accusation. It came with hurt. And that hurt was harder to face. "I thought it was behind me," I said. "I thought it didn't matter anymore." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked something I wasn't prepared for. "Did you grieve?" I blinked. "What?" "Did you grieve?" he repeated. The question cracked something open inside me, because I had never framed it that way. I had called it regret, shame, mistake, responsibility. But grief? No. "I don't think I allowed myself to," I admitted. He nodded again. "That explains a lot." My stomach tightened. "Explains what?" He looked at me carefully, choosing his words. "There were times in our marriage when you seemed far away. I'd ask what was wrong and you'd say nothing, but it never felt like nothing." I swallowed. I thought that was just stress. Sometimes, he said gently, but sometimes it felt like you were protecting yourself from something. I stared at him. For decades, I thought I had hidden it well. Apparently not. You never asked, I whispered. He gave a sad smile. I did, just not the right questions. Silence settled between us. Not tense, just honest. Then he said something that shifted everything. I wish you had trusted me with it. Trust. There it was. Not judgment, not condemnation, trust. And suddenly I realized something painful. By keeping that secret, I hadn't just protected myself, I had kept him at arm's length emotionally, even when I thought I was being fully present. Have you ever convinced yourself you're open while still holding back the most vulnerable parts? That was me. I didn't know how to say it, I admitted. You just did, he replied softly. We both let out a quiet breath at the same time. After a moment, he asked something I wasn't prepared for. Did you want that baby? The question landed differently coming from him. No agenda, no fear, just curiosity. Yes, I said without hesitation. Yes, I did. He nodded. Then of course you grieved. Of course. Such simple words. Such a massive realization. I had spent 40 years telling myself it was practical, necessary, logical. But underneath all that logic was a woman who had wanted her child and never mourned properly. He stood up and walked over to where I was sitting. Instead of lecturing or analyzing, he just wrapped his arms around me. And I cried. Not polite tears, not silent tears. Full-bodied grief that had been waiting 4 decades for permission. I cried for the 21-year-old girl who felt alone. I cried for my mother at 17. I cried for my daughter at 22. And I cried for the years I lost to silence. After a while, he pulled back slightly. You know what hurts me most? He said quietly. What? That you carried this alone while sitting right beside me. That sentence pierced deep, because it was true. I had carried it alone out of habit, not necessity. Later that night, lying in bed, he asked something else. Did it affect how you felt when we got pregnant with our first? I stared at the ceiling. Yes, I admitted. How? I was afraid to get attached. There it was again. Fear of attachment. He reached for my hand in the dark. I wondered why you didn't want to decorate the nursery until the 3rd trimester, he said softly. I almost laughed through tears. I told you I was just cautious. I believed you. He squeezed my hand gently. But now I understand. Understanding. That word kept coming back in different forms. Understanding doesn't erase the past, but it softens it. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted in our marriage. I found myself sharing more, not just about the past, but about present fears too. Little things, big things, and each time I did, the world didn't collapse. He didn't pull away. He leaned in, which made me realize how much of my emotional isolation had been self-imposed. Silence can feel noble, but it can also be pride disguised as strength. One Sunday afternoon, my daughter came over for dinner. We sat around the table, my husband, my daughter, and me, talking about small things. Work, church, groceries, normal life. But beneath the surface, something was different. There was more openness, more honesty in the air. After dinner, my husband excused himself to the living room. My daughter lingered at the table. I've been thinking about therapy, she said. I raised an eyebrow. For what? For this, she replied, gesturing vaguely between us. The pregnancy, grandma, everything. I nodded slowly. I think that's wise. She studied my face. You'd never consider that, would you? The old version of me would have said no immediately. Therapy was for other people. We prayed, we endured, we didn't unpack. But the new version of me paused. Maybe I should, I said honestly. Her eyes widened slightly. Really? Yes. Because here's the truth I was beginning to see. Breaking generational patterns isn't just about saying different words, it's about doing different work. And some of that work requires help. Have you ever noticed how we'll go to a doctor for our bodies without hesitation, but hesitate to seek help for wounds that shaped our entire emotional lives? I made an appointment 2 weeks later. Sitting in that therapist office at 62 felt strange, like I was late to a meeting everyone else attended years ago. But when she asked me about regret, the words flowed easier than I expected. And for the first time, I said something that surprised even me. I don't regret loving that baby, I said. She nodded gently. What do you regret? I regret not fighting for myself. That distinction mattered. It wasn't just about the pregnancy, it was about voice, autonomy, courage, and the pattern of deferring to authority out of fear. That pattern had shown up in other areas too. Career decisions, friendships, even church dynamics. I had a habit of shrinking when things felt uncertain, and it all traced back to that first major crossroad at 21. One decision, multiple ripples. As the months passed, my daughter grew stronger. She talked more openly about her experience. She even shared parts of it with a close friend. The silence was breaking. But healing doesn't move without resistance, because just when I thought we were on stable ground, my daughter told me something that stopped me cold, something that forced me to confront whether support alone was enough. And what she asked me next, it required more than encouragement. It required action. And I wasn't sure I was brave enough for that yet. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my daughter said it. We were sitting on my back porch. The air was cool, not quite winter, not quite fall, that kind of weather that makes you reach for a light sweater but still feel the sun on your face. She had a cup of tea in her hands, staring out into the yard like she was rehearsing something in her mind. Mom, she said finally, I'm pregnant again. The words didn't shock me the way they had the first time. They landed differently, heavier, but steadier. I felt my heart beat hard once, twice, and then I did exactly what I promised myself I would do. I didn't ask what she planned to do. I didn't ask if she was sure. I didn't ask about timing. I asked, how do you feel? Her eyes filled immediately. Terrified, she admitted. Then she laughed a little, but also happy. Happy. That word felt fragile and powerful all at once. I nodded slowly. Both can exist, I said gently. She exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for days. I was afraid to tell you, she continued. I didn't want you to think I was being irresponsible. I leaned forward. Listen to me carefully, I said. You are not irresponsible for wanting your child. The wind moved softly through the trees behind us. She wiped her eyes. I need you with me this time, she said quietly. And there it was. Not just emotional support, with me. That meant appointments, conversations, possibly tension with the father. Real life involvement, not just warm words from a distance. I didn't hesitate. I'm with you. And I meant it. But support isn't tested in calm moments. It's tested when complications arise. 3 weeks later, she called me from the doctor's office. Her voice was shaking. They saw something. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? There might be an issue. They're not sure yet. Not sure. That phrase again. Time suspended, fear creeping in. I drove to the clinic faster than I probably should have. When I walked into the waiting room, she looked small again, small and scared. And suddenly, I was 21 in a different waiting room. Only this time, I wasn't alone, and neither was she. The doctor explained there was a possibility of a complication. It wasn't definitive, more tests were needed, but the word risk was used more than once. Risk to her health, risk to the baby. The air felt thick. After the appointment, we sat in the car in silence. She stared straight ahead. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," she whispered. I turned toward her. Strength isn't pretending you're not scared. It's walking through fear without letting it make the decision for you. I surprised myself with that, because I was speaking to myself as much as to her. She looked at me. "What if something's wrong?" "Then we face it together." Together. Such a simple word, such a powerful one. But life doesn't unfold neatly. The test results came back inconclusive, more waiting, more uncertainty. And during that waiting, the father of the baby started pulling away. He said he needed space. Isn't that something? Men needing space when women are carrying weight. I tried not to let bitterness creep into my tone, because this wasn't about Daniel. This wasn't about the past. But patterns have a way of echoing. One night, she showed up at my door unannounced. "I think he's going to leave," she said flatly. The familiarity of that sentence hit me like a wave. I opened the door wider. "Come inside." We sat at the kitchen table again. That table had seen so much. Confessions, silence, grief. Now, courage. "I don't want to beg him," she said. "Then don't." She looked at me sharply. "That's it?" "Yes." Silence. I stayed silent once because I thought keeping a man mattered more than keeping my voice, I said slowly. "I won't advise you to do that." Her eyes softened. "I'm scared to do this alone." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not alone." And I realized in that moment, this was the fork in the road where history either repeats or breaks. Not because circumstances are perfect, but because response changes. Weeks passed. Her body changed. The baby grew. The father drifted further, and I watched my daughter wrestle with fear in real time. But something was different this time. She spoke her fears out loud. She cried openly. She asked questions. She didn't bury it. And that alone told me the cycle was cracking. One evening, as we folded tiny baby clothes she had started buying cautiously, she looked at me and asked something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about what they would have looked like?" The question was soft, not accusatory, just curious. I paused. "Yes," I admitted. "What do you imagine?" I smiled faintly. "Dark hair, stubborn like me." She laughed gently. "Probably dramatic, too." "Oh, definitely." We both laughed. And that laughter felt sacred because it wasn't soaked in shame. It was acknowledgement without self-destruction. Have you ever noticed how healing doesn't erase memory? It reframes it. I still felt regret, but it didn't own me the way it once did. Therapy helped. Honest conversations helped. But most of all, witnessing my daughter choose differently helped. Then, one afternoon, she had a scare. Sharp pains, unexpected bleeding, the hospital again. Bright lights, monitors, waiting. My heart pounded in that sterile room, and I found myself whispering a prayer I hadn't prayed in decades. Not the polished church kind, the desperate mother kind. Please let her keep this one. Hours felt like days. The doctor finally came in. "It's stable," he said. She needs rest, but the baby is okay. Okay. I didn't realize how much tension I was holding until it released all at once. When I walked back into her room, she looked exhausted but relieved. "I thought I lost it," she whispered. I brushed her hair back gently. "You didn't." She looked at me carefully. "Did you feel like that?" That question pierced deep. "Yes," I said honestly. I felt like I lost something I never got to hold. Tears filled her eyes. She reached for my hand. "I'm sorry you went through that alone." That sentence healed something inside me that therapy hadn't quite touched. Because sometimes what we need isn't correction, it's acknowledgement. Months later, her belly rounded beautifully. The father didn't return, and strangely, it didn't destroy her. It hurt, but it didn't define her. Because this time, fear didn't get the final vote. And watching her walk through pregnancy with courage, even in uncertainty, it forced me to confront one final piece of my own regret. There was something I had never allowed myself to do, something I had avoided because it felt foolish. But as I watched her prepare to become a mother, I realized I needed to do it. Not for closure, not for drama, but for peace. And what I chose to do next, it surprised even me. Because at 62 years old, I found myself doing something I should have done at 21. And when my daughter saw it, she understood exactly why. It started with a letter. Not the kind you mail, not the kind anyone else reads, just paper, a pen, and a truth that had waited 40 years to be spoken without interruption. I sat at my dining room table early one morning before the sun fully rose. The house was quiet. Even the refrigerator hum felt softer. I stared at the blank page for a long time. What do you say to someone who never got to live? What do you call them? Baby? Child? Name them? I realized something uncomfortable in that moment. I had never allowed that pregnancy to feel human. I had kept it clinical, abstract, undefined. Because if you don't define something, you don't have to grieve it properly. But healing requires specificity. So I wrote, "I don't know if you were a son or a daughter." The words looked strange on the page, intimate, exposed. I was young and scared, and I chose obedience over instinct. My hand trembled slightly. "I want you to know you were wanted." There it was. The truth. Not complicated, not political, just honest. Wanted. Tears dropped onto the paper, smudging the ink slightly. I kept writing. About the ultrasound flicker, about the march counting, about the silence, about how I hoped they forgave me. Now, before you think I'd lost my mind, let me ask you something. Have you ever needed to say something out loud, even if no one was there to hear it? Sometimes the act of speaking is less about the listener and more about freeing yourself. When I finished, I didn't feel dramatic relief, no thunderclap, no cinematic breakthrough, just lighter, like I had opened a window in a room that had been sealed too long. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. And then I did something I had never done before. I told my daughter about it. She was sitting on my couch when I handed it to her. "You don't have to read it," I said quickly. "I just needed you to know I wrote it." She held the envelope gently. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I don't want to carry unspoken grief into your child's life." That sentence hung in the air. She nodded slowly. "Do you want to do something with it?" I hadn't thought that far ahead. But then she said something that made my breath catch. "We could plant something." Plant something? A tree, a flower, a physical acknowledgement without spectacle. I felt tears sting my eyes. I'd like that, I said softly. The following Saturday, we went to a small nursery on the edge of town. It smelled like soil and fresh leaves. Peaceful. We walked slowly between rows of plants until she stopped in front of a small dogwood tree. It blooms in early spring, she said. March. I swallowed. That's perfect. We planted it in my backyard together. The soil was cool in my hands. There was something deeply grounding about that moment. Not ritualistic, not religious, just intentional. After we finished, we stood back and looked at it. No speeches, no dramatic music, just quiet understanding. And for the first time in 40 years, March didn't feel like a shadow. It felt like remembrance without shame. Later that evening, as we sat on the porch looking at that small tree, my daughter placed her hand on her belly. "I've been thinking about names," she said. My heart fluttered. "Already?" She smiled slightly. "It makes it feel real." Real. That word again. This pregnancy wasn't wrapped in fear the same way mine had been. It had uncertainty. It had difficulty. But it also had voice. And that difference mattered. "I'm thinking about using Grandma's middle name if it's a girl," she added. That caught me off guard. "Really?" She nodded. She wasn't perfect, but she tried. That statement held maturity I didn't have at her age. I used to see my mother in black and white, right or wrong, strong or controlling. Now I saw her in gray, human, complicated, doing the best she knew how with wounds she never addressed. Forgiveness doesn't excuse harm, but it contextualizes it. Weeks passed. Her belly grew rounder. The doctor appointments became more reassuring. The father remained distant, but something surprising happened. He called one afternoon, said he wanted to talk. When she told me, I felt a flash of old fear rise up, history trying to whisper, "See, this is where it falls apart." But this wasn't my story anymore. It was hers. "What are you going to do?" I almost asked. Almost. Instead, I said, "How do you feel about talking to him?" She paused. "I want to hear what he has to say, but I'm not begging." I smiled softly. "That sounds like clarity." She met him for coffee. When she came back to my house afterward, I could read her face immediately. "It's not happening," she said simply. "He's not ready?" "No, and I'm not waiting." There was sadness in her eyes, but there wasn't desperation, and that difference told me everything. She had learned something I hadn't at 21. Your worth doesn't hinge on who stays. It hinges on whether you abandon yourself. That night, I lay in bed thinking about that sentence, because if I'm honest, part of my original decision had been about Daniel staying, about proving I wasn't disposable. And when he left anyway, I was left with both loss and abandonment, double grief. No wonder it shaped me. No wonder I guarded myself in my marriage. No wonder intimacy felt risky. But here's what surprised me most during this season. As my daughter's pregnancy progressed, my own joy began to surface in ways I didn't expect. I found myself excited, buying small blankets, talking to her belly, imagining holding that baby. And for a brief moment, guilt tried to creep in. "You don't deserve this joy," it whispered. But that voice no longer had authority, because healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means refusing to let it dictate the future. Then came the day that made everything feel full circle. We were at one of her later appointments when the doctor turned the screen towards us. "There," he said gently, "clear as day, heartbeat steady, movement visible." I stared at that screen, and instead of feeling hollow like I had at 21, I felt present, fully present. My daughter squeezed my hand. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, tears sliding down my face. "Yes," I whispered. This time, I wasn't looking at a flicker I would never see again. This time, I was looking at a future. But healing is rarely linear, because just when we thought we were past the hardest part, life introduced a new kind of fear, one that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with survival. And as we approached her due date, an unexpected complication forced me to confront something I hadn't fully released yet. Because when the hospital monitors started beeping rapidly during labor, 40 years collapsed into a single, terrifying moment. And I realized healing doesn't mean fear disappears. It means you face it differently. The day she went into labor, the sky was heavy with rain. Not storming, just thick and gray, like the air was holding its breath. She called me at 4:12 in the morning. "Mom, it's time." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent, that mix of excitement and fear that makes everything feel electric. "I'm on my way," I said, already reaching for my robe. By the time we got to the hospital, contractions were strong and regular. She gripped my hand in the elevator, breathing through each wave like she had practiced. "You're doing beautifully," I told her. She laughed weakly. "It doesn't feel beautiful." Labor rarely does. Hours passed. Nurses came and went. Monitors beeped steadily, and for a while, everything was normal. Until it wasn't. It happened quickly. One of the nurses frowned at the screen. "Let me get the doctor," she said calmly. Too calmly. I watched the monitor. The steady rhythm I had memorized over the past months began to shift. Slow, then fast, then irregular. My stomach dropped. My daughter saw my face change. "What?" she whispered. "Nothing," I lied instinctively, old habits trying to rise again. But then I caught myself. "No," I corrected gently. "They're just checking something." The room filled with people quickly, voices low but urgent, medical terms I didn't fully understand. Risk, distress, intervention. 40 years collapsed in an instant. Suddenly, I wasn't 62, I was 21, in a cold room, powerless, heart pounding. Only this time, I wasn't the girl in the bed, I was the mother standing beside it. And this time, I wasn't silent. "What's happening?" I asked firmly. The doctor looked at me briefly. "The baby's heart rate is dropping during contractions. We may need to move quickly." Move quickly, the phrase echoed. I felt fear try to flood my chest. But fear didn't get to decide this time. My daughter grabbed my hand. "Mom." "I'm right here," I said, steadying my voice. They explained the possibility of an emergency procedure. Consent forms appeared. Pens were handed over. And for a split second, my breath caught at the sight of paper needing signatures. Memory is strange like that. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't fear dictating silence. This was informed action. My daughter looked at me. Should I do it? There it was. The moment. The fork in the road. And I chose differently. "This is your body," I said gently. "What feels right to you?" She held my gaze for a long moment. "I want the baby safe." "Then say that," I whispered. She turned to the doctor. "Do what you need to do." Clear, confident. Her voice didn't tremble. They moved quickly after that. The room shifted into focused urgency. I stepped back slightly as nurses adjusted equipment, and I did the only thing I could. I prayed. Not polished church prayers, Just simple words. Please, please, please. Minutes stretched unbearably. And then a cry. Sharp, strong, alive. The kind of sound that splits fear in half. My knees nearly gave out. They lifted the baby briefly before taking her to be checked. Her. A girl. Tears blurred my vision. My daughter lay exhausted, but alert. "Is she okay?" she whispered. "She's crying," I said, laughing through tears. "That's a good sign." After what felt like forever, but was probably only minutes, they placed that tiny baby in my daughter's arms. And something inside me settled in a way I didn't know was possible. It wasn't just joy. It was closure without denial. It was witnessing life where once there had been loss. It was breaking a pattern, not by erasing the past, but by responding differently in the present. My daughter looked at her child with awe. "She's real," she whispered. "Yes," I said softly, "she is." Later, when the room quieted and the medical staff stepped out, she looked up at me. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not deciding for me." The weight of that sentence nearly crushed me, because it was so simple, and yet it changed everything. "I learned the hard way," I replied gently. She studied my face. "Do you still regret it?" she asked quietly. The question didn't sting the way it once would have. I considered it honestly. "I regret that I didn't feel strong enough to choose differently," I said slowly. "But I don't live in that regret anymore." She nodded thoughtfully. "What changed?" "You." That answer surprised even me, but it was true. Watching her face fear without surrendering her voice had healed something in me that decades of silence had hardened. Over the next few days, I stayed close, holding the baby, changing diapers, watching my daughter step into motherhood with both trembling hands and fierce love. There were hard moments, exhaustion, tears, doubt, but there was no shame, no secrecy, no inherited silence wrapping itself around her throat. One evening, as I rocked the baby while my daughter slept, I looked down at that tiny face. Dark hair, strong lungs, stubborn already, and I thought about the dogwood tree in my backyard, about the letter folded in an envelope, about April and March, about 17 and 21 and 22, and I realized something profound. Grief and gratitude can exist in the same heart. I will always carry the memory of the child I didn't have. That doesn't disappear, but it no longer defines my identity. It informs it. There's a difference. When we brought the baby home, the house felt different. Full. Alive. The kind of fullness that pushes old shadows into corners. A week later, we sat on the porch together, my daughter, the baby in her arms, and me. The dogwood tree was still small, leaves just beginning to bud. She looked at it. "Does it hurt less now?" she asked gently. I followed her gaze. "Yes," I said honestly. "Why?" "Because the silence is gone." And that was the truth. The silence had been heavier than the regret, heavier than the memory. Silence isolates, truth connects, and connection heals. But healing doesn't mean there won't be moments when memory sneaks back in unexpectedly, because a few weeks later, something small happened that caught me off guard. Not dramatic, not tragic, just quiet. And it made me realize there was one final conversation I still needed to have. Not with my daughter, not with my husband, but with myself. Because full healing requires one last thing, and I hadn't quite reached it yet. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. Nothing dramatic. No hospital monitors, no life-altering phone calls, no tears. Just sunlight filtering through the living room window and the soft sound of my granddaughter breathing against my chest. She was 6 weeks old, warm, heavy in that comforting way only babies can be, the kind of weight that feels like trust. I was rocking slowly in the chair by the window, humming something off key and half remembered from my own childhood. My daughter had run to the store for diapers. The house was quiet. And then my granddaughter stirred. Her tiny hand stretched upward, fingers opening and closing as if grasping at something invisible. Instinctively, I placed my finger in her palm. She gripped it tight. And just like that, something in me unraveled. Not painfully, not sharply, just gently. I started crying, not because I was sad, not because I was overwhelmed, but because for the first time in 40 years, I allowed myself to imagine holding the child I didn't. Fully imagine it. Not as regret, not as punishment, just as possibility. I pictured a small body like this one, a soft weight against my chest, tiny fingers wrapping around mine, and instead of pushing the image away like I used to, I let it stay. Have you ever noticed how sometimes healing isn't about forgetting? It's about finally letting yourself feel what you avoided. For decades, I wouldn't let my mind create a full picture. It was too dangerous, too painful. But sitting there with my granddaughter breathing softly against me, I realized something. The love I felt for her did not betray the child I lost. It honored them. Because love doesn't divide, it expands. I whispered something quietly, almost without thinking. I'm sorry. Not in shame, not in self-condemnation, just acknowledgement. I'm sorry you didn't get to stay. And for the first time, the apology didn't feel like it was tearing me apart. It felt like closure. Later that evening, when my daughter came home, she found me sitting quietly at the kitchen table. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I think so." She studied my face. "You look different." "Different how?" "Lighter." I smiled faintly. "I had a conversation today." "With who?" she asked playfully. "With myself." She laughed. "That sounds intense." It was overdue. She sat down across from me. "Tell me." So I did. I told her about holding the baby, about the memories surfacing without panic, about the apology that didn't crush me. She listened without interruption, and when I finished, she said something that made my throat tighten. "You're not the same woman who sat at this table the first time I told you I was pregnant." She was right. Back then, I was operating from fear, dressed up as wisdom. Now, I was operating from experience, softened by truth. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stepped outside, alone. The air was cool. The dogwood tree in the backyard had started to bloom, small white flowers unfolding quietly in the dark. March had come again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt reflective. I stood there for a long time thinking about 17-year-old my mother, 21-year-old me, 22-year-old my daughter, and I realized something that surprised me. We were never weak. We were uninformed. Unprepared, unsupported, but not weak. And weakness is what I had called myself for years. If I had been stronger, if I had fought harder, if I had spoken up, But strength isn't always loud. And at 21, I didn't lack strength. I lacked models. I lacked someone saying, you can choose differently. We cannot expect courage where there has been no example. That realization softened my judgment toward my younger self and toward my mother. The next Sunday at church, a young woman stood up during testimony time. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly, "and I don't know what to do." You could feel the room shift. Whispers, side glances, that old familiar tension. And without planning to, without rehearsing, I stood up. Now, I am not the type to draw attention, never have been. But that day, something in me refused to sit down. I walked over to her slowly, and I said, loud enough for the room to hear, "You don't have to decide from fear." The sanctuary went still. I continued, "You have time to ask yourself how you feel, and whatever you feel deserves to be heard." Her eyes filled with tears. So did mine. After service, several women approached me quietly. Some thanked me. Some shared their own stories in hushed tones, stories buried for decades. It struck me then how common silence is. How many women carry entire lifetimes of unspoken decisions? How many regret not having space to process? That afternoon, as I drove home, I realized something final and clear. My regret had transformed. It was no longer a wound. It was wisdom. Not the rigid kind, not the controlling kind, the compassionate kind. Regret, when examined honestly, can either make you bitter or make you tender. I had been bitter for years without realizing it, short-tempered in subtle ways, guarded emotionally. Now I felt tender, open. And openness is risky, but it's also freeing. That evening, my husband sat beside me on the couch. "You've changed," he said quietly. "In a good way?" I asked. He smiled. "In a peaceful way." Peace. Not perfection, not erasure. Peace. And I realized something else. Closure doesn't come from rewriting history. It comes from responding differently to it. The child I didn't have will always be part of my story, but they are no longer the shadow. They are the teacher. And my granddaughter, sleeping softly in the next room, is not a replacement. She is a continuation of choice made differently, of voice spoken clearly, of fear acknowledged but not obeyed. Before I went to bed that night, I walked once more to the backyard. The dogwood blossoms glowed faintly under the porch light. I placed my hand against the trunk. "Thank you," I whispered. "Not for the pain, but for the growth. Because sometimes the hardest chapters in our lives become the ones that teach us to love more honestly. And if there's one thing I understand now at 62, it's this. Silence feels safe, but truth sets generations free." If you had told me at 21 that the decision I made in fear would shape the next 40 years of my life, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have said, it's just one choice. But there are some choices that don't end when the moment ends. They echo in how you love, in how you speak, in how you stay silent. For a long time, I thought my story was about regret. But standing here now, 62 years old, grandmother, wife, mother, I understand something deeper. My story was never just about a pregnancy. It was about voice. It was about fair. It was about what happens when women are taught endurance before they're taught autonomy. And maybe, just maybe, that's why you're still listening. Because somewhere in your own life, there's a decision you made in fear, or a silence you carried too long, or a moment you wish you could revisit with the wisdom you have now. let me tell you something I had to learn the long way. You cannot go back, but you can go forward differently. That's where freedom lives, not in erasing the past, but in responding to it with honesty. A few months after my granddaughter was born, I found myself alone with my husband on the porch one evening. The baby was inside with my daughter. The dogwood tree was in full bloom. He looked over at me and said, "Do you ever wonder who you would have been if that hadn't happened?" I thought about it carefully. "Yes," I said. "And?" "I think I would have been softer, sooner." He nodded slowly. "But maybe you wouldn't be who you are now." That statement lingered, because here's the complicated truth. Pain changes you. Sometimes it hardens you, sometimes it deepens you. Sometimes both. The younger version of me didn't know how to fight for her voice, but the older version of me learned how to protect it and teach it and model it. One afternoon, my daughter sat across from me at the same kitchen table that had witnessed so much history. Her daughter, my granddaughter, slept in a carrier beside her. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About what I want to teach her." I smiled. "That's the right question." She looked thoughtful. "I want her to know that her feelings matter." Yes. And that fear isn't the enemy, but it doesn't get to make the decision. I felt my eyes sting. "That's wisdom," I said softly. She hesitated, then added, "I also want her to know that if she ever makes a choice she regrets, it doesn't have to define her forever." That sentence landed deep, because that was the final piece of healing I hadn't quite put into words. Regret does not get to define you forever. It can inform you, it can humble you, it can teach you, but it does not get to own your identity. For years, I quietly labeled myself as the woman who gave up her first child. That was the narrative I carried internally, but that wasn't the full truth. I was also the woman who learned, the woman who apologized, the woman who broke the silence, the woman who stood up in church and told a young girl she didn't have to decide from fear. We are not one decision. We are the sum of what we do afterward. Now, let me ask you something directly. Is there a part of your story you've been carrying in silence? Is there a younger version of you that you still judge harshly? What would happen if you spoke to her with compassion instead of criticism? I had to learn to forgive the 21-year-old me, not because what happened didn't matter, but because she was doing the best she knew how with the tools she had, and sometimes that's all any of us are doing. A year passed. My granddaughter learned to sit up, to crawl, to laugh in that deep belly way that makes the whole room feel alive. Every March, I still glance at the dogwood tree, but it doesn't feel like a wound anymore. It feels like remembrance, and remembrance is different from regret. One is heavy, the other is honoring. On my 63rd birthday, my daughter gave me a small framed photo. It was a picture of me holding my granddaughter under the blooming dogwood tree. On the back, she had written, "You broke the cycle." I cried when I read it, not because I was perfect, not because I fixed everything, but because I chose differently when it mattered most. Breaking cycles doesn't require dramatic speeches. It requires small, consistent shifts. Asking, "How do you feel?" instead of, "Are you sure?" Saying, "I'm with you," instead of, "You'll ruin your life." Listening instead of directing, supporting instead of controlling. And sometimes it requires going back into your own story and telling the truth about it. The truth that I obeyed my mother, the truth that I regretted it, the truth that she had once been a scared 17-year-old girl herself, the truth that fear traveled through our family like an inheritance, and the truth that it stopped traveling when someone finally said, "This ends with me." Not in anger, not in rebellion, but in awareness. If my mother were alive today, I think she would understand that. I think she would sit beside me under that dogwood tree and admit what she couldn't at 25 or 45, that she loved me, that she was afraid, that she was trying. And I would tell her what I know now. You were human. We don't heal by pretending our mothers were villains. We heal by recognizing they were women shaped by their own silence and choosing differently. That's the work. That's the legacy. As I sit here now telling you this story, I don't feel crushed by it anymore. I feel steady. Regret taught me tenderness, grief taught me honesty, and silence taught me the power of voice. So, if you're listening and carrying something heavy, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not the worst thing you've ever done. You are not the decision you made when you were scared, and you are not required to keep inheriting silence. Speak it. Name it. Plant something if you need to. Write the letter. Have the conversation. Stand up in the room. Because when one woman breaks silence, she doesn't just free herself. She frees the generations behind her. And that is worth every uncomfortable truth. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. If this story touched your heart, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about resilience, dignity, and quiet justice. Because some lessons don't come with applause. They come with peace.